Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar entitled Emergency Solutions Grants Program Using IDIS for Financial Management, Part 1. This is the first in a series of 3 webinars on the topic of financial management for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. This webinar is designed as a high-level overview. Our presenters today will be Marlisa Grogan with the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, known as SNAPS, at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Good afternoon, Marlisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm a desk officer for the ESG and COC programs in the SNAPS office, and I've been doing a lot of work on CAPER reporting and enhancing ESG data collection. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Marlisa. Also presenting today is me. My name is Chris Pitcher. I am a Senior Technical Specialist with ICF International, one of 2 national experts in the use of IDIS for the ESG program. I am a HUD TA provider and have been providing TA in ESG, HMIS, IDIS, and COC for about 7 years, and I'm glad to be here. Finally, presenting and answering your questions submitted via the GoToWebinar today is Heidi Schultz, Senior Analyst from the Cloudburst Group, the other national expert in the use of IDIS for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. Good afternoon, Heidi.
Good afternoon, Chris. Again, my name is Heidi Schultz, and I'm a Senior Analyst with the Cloudburst Group. I have been providing IDIS technical assistance for the past 5 years, specifically working with the ESG and HPRP programs. Prior to that, I worked with the Neighborhood Stabilization Program and assisted grantees with DRGR. Currently, in addition to providing ESG technical assistance, I am the IDIS question pool manager on the HUD Exchange.
Thanks, Heidi. Before we get started, let's cover a few of the logistics for today's webinar. First, all participants will be muted throughout the webinar. Second, the webinar will be recorded and posted to the HUD Exchange within a week for your further reference and for those who are unable to make it today. This webinar has a few poll questions throughout to help us gauge the audience knowledge level on certain topics. Please answer these questions quickly so we can maintain the pace of the webinar. If you would like to ask for further guidance, or if you have questions on the topics that we cover today, please feel free to type your questions into the questions box located on your GoToWebinar panel, and Heidi will answer these as she is able throughout the presentation. If your question does not have an answer or cannot be answered during the webinar, we will direct you to submit an IDIS or ESG-related Ask a Question. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Marlisa.
This presentation is the first of 3 webinars, and the only one that will be presented live, designed to provide an overview of how recipients can use IDIS for effective financial management of their Emergency Solutions Grants Program. While today's webinar is more of a broad introduction, the next 2 webinars, which will be posted online in the future, will provide more specific training on how to use IDIS for financial management of the ESG program. It's also important to know that basic financial management training resources are already available on the HUD Exchange. It's a good idea to review the 3 modules in combination with these ESG-specific webinars. You can find a link to the financial management curriculum towards the end of the presentation. Also, remember that in IDIS, the ESG program is managed in the HESG path, not the ESG path, which is used for the Emergency Shelter Grants Program. This presentation only covers the Emergency Solutions Grants Program and the HESG path in IDIS. IDIS is not the only reporting system for the ESG program at HUD or at the ESG local, subrecipient, and recipient level. The various reporting systems I'm about to highlight often work together to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the ESG program at the national and local levels. For the purposes of this webinar, I'll now briefly touch on each of these common reporting systems that are associated with the ESG program. First, we have IDIS, which is the financial management system of record for the ESG program. Then there's the Econ Planning Suite, where recipients submit their con plan and capers in IDIS. The Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, is a locally designated data collection system that ESG-funded programs are required to use to collect client-level data, which is reported on the ESG-specific sections of the CAPER. And recipients' internal financial management systems, which are the various systems that you, as recipients, are using at a local level that address your financial data needs beyond IDIS. Let's begin by reviewing grant-based accounting principles. Chris will kick off this section with a poll question.
Thanks, Marlisa. Here is poll question number 1. In IDIS, ESG recipients currently use first in, first out, also known as FIFO, accounting principles to financially manage the program. True or false? The answer is false. In 2011, the ESG program became the first HUD program to remove first in, first out accounting principles in favor of the grant-based accounting principles that are currently in use in IDIS. Next, Marlisa will continue with the grant-based accounting principles. Marlisa?
Thanks, Chris. The HESG path used in IDIS for the ESG program has specific requirements regarding activity setup, funding, and draws. In the past, Emergency Shelter Grants program using the ESG path in IDIS followed the first in, first out, or FIFO accounting methodology. Here's some background on the transition from FIFO to grant-based accounting for ESG. Under FIFO, Emergency Shelter Grants program funds were committed and dispersed against the oldest grants with available funds. The HARS Act amended the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which, among other changes, revised the Emergency Shelter Grants program and renamed the program the Emergency Solutions Grants program. In IDIS, the Emergency Solutions Grants program was set up in the HESG program path in 2011. The HESG program path does not follow FIFO and instead implements grant-based accounting practices in activity setup, funding, and drawdown procedures. Under grant-based accounting, funding and disbursements are made against specific user-defined grant years. Generally, this accounting practice will strengthen the linkage between an annual grant allocation and the actual expenditure of those funds, streamlining the year-end reconciliation between IDIS and local financial systems. Since 2011, HESG has implemented grant-based accounting principles by requiring recipients to set up each year's grant as its own project, from which only activities set up under the same grant year may be funded with that grant year allocation. It's very important that funds from each fiscal year are set up and drawn only within that fiscal year, which is also referred to as the program year in IDIS. Failure to do so will cause lengthy data cleanup efforts and HUD involvement. You may already be aware that the other CPD formula programs, CDBG, HOME, and HOPWA, have started implementing grant-based accounting in IDIS with fiscal year 2015 funds. Because the HESG program path has functioned in accordance with grant-based accounting practices since 2011, the setup and funding of ESG projects and activities will not change for fiscal year 2015 allocations. In order to ensure that they are funding and drawing against the correct grant year, recipients must carefully follow the protocols established in the IDIS Manual for ESG. The graphic on this slide is a visual representation of grant-based accounting for ESG. Think of the red lines that you're seeing here between the grant years as boundaries separating one grant year's funding from the next. Let's take the program year 2014 grant, for example. For HESG, the 2014 grant is set up in IDIS as one 2014 project under which 2014 activities such as emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, etc., are set up for each component that the recipient will be carrying out. If you need to reprogram funds, you have the flexibility to do so, as long as those funds are kept within their particular grant year. So you can shift funding from your 2014 street outreach activity to an emergency shelter activity, as long as the 2014 street outreach funds are reprogrammed to the 2014 emergency shelter activity. Another situation that recipients may deal with is the need to reprogram funds from one subrecipient to another within the same activity. This is also possible, staying within the same grant year. If, for example, one subrecipient funded with 2014 emergency shelter dollars is having difficulty spending down those funds, the recipient can reprogram those funds to another subrecipient carrying out emergency shelter activities, as long as those funds stay within the 2014 emergency shelter activity. Recipients should also keep in mind when these types of changes may trigger amendment or substantial amendment requirements. There are differences in activity setup, funding, and disbursement in IDIS that are unique to each CPD formula program. See a matrix of key changes by program on the HUD exchange for specific differences between CDBG, Home, HAPWA, and ESG. One primary difference between ESG and the other programs is the funding and disbursement of pre-2015 funds. While other CPD formula programs consolidate all grants through program year 2014 into one pot of funding that's dispersed on a FIFO basis within each fund type and recipient, the ESG program treats fiscal year 2011, 12, 13, and 2014 as separate pots of funding that must align with projects and activities set up under the same year as I just described, and also represented by this graphic. In order to maintain grant-based accounting in IDIS, data quality is essential. Remember these key practices to ensure that you're complying with grant-based accounting principles in IDIS. Just to highlight a few, admin subfund. If you do not reprogram funds from the admin subfund, you will not be able to access those funds. Using an incorrect naming convention. This can lead to problems such as not knowing what ESG components you're really funding or whether the correct grant source year of funding was used to fund specific activities. Also, remember, if you need to reprogram 2013 funds, for example, the funds must stay in 2013 activities. And you can get an ESG allocation annually, but you have 2 years to fully expend the funds. So it's likely that subrecipient organizations may be funded for multiple fiscal years at the same time. Even if that's the case, these funds must still be tracked by grant year and remain separate in IDIS. I'm now going to turn it back to Chris.
Thanks, Marlisa. In this next section, we're going to cover some ESG financial management functions of IDIS data now that we've established the grant-based accounting principles. First, let's go to poll number 2. In IDIS, ESG recipients can analyze performance regarding the following funding caps. A, 7.5% administration cap. B, street outreach and emergency shelter cap. C, both. Or D, neither. The answer is C, both. The administration has a hard 7.5% cap, and IDIS safeguards you against exceeding this cap. Also, street outreach and emergency shelter is capped at the higher of 60%, or the fiscal year 2010 amount that the ESG recipient used for homeless assistance. If you are unsure if you are going to exceed this cap, work with your local HUD field office. Here are the regulatory and statutory requirements that you can track in IDIS to maintain fiscal compliance. IDIS is a tool that is useful for tracking these requirements. IDIS can also be used to monitor subrecipients and manage your program to help make sure it's meeting your goals. The obligation date is the date that HUD signs the ESG contract and also begins all the quarterly and annual deadlines. The expenditure date is 2 years from the obligation date when all ESG funds should be expended. If you're having difficulty meeting the expenditure deadline, seek guidance from your local field office or submit and ask a question. In IDIS, we also monitor if you are completing at least quarterly draws as required by the ESG program, and we monitor the expenditure caps that we mentioned in our second poll. IDIS is also useful to HUD. HUD uses the PR91 report on a regular basis when an ESG recipient may be having trouble. Field offices use the data when they go monitor, and we look at the national data to see how the funds are being expended. From the Secretary of HUD to the White House, Congress, the press, and the public all ask for data about how grantees are doing and how they are spending the funds. HUD continues to encourage recipients to spend funds on rapid rehousing activities, and this is one way that we monitor IDIS. For example, HUD monitors the national progress in allocating funds to rapid rehousing by comparing the PR92 report across fiscal years. Our latest analysis detailed the amount of funds all ESG recipients committed for rapid rehousing increased from about 16% in 2011 to 23% in 2012, 23.45% in 13, and finally to 23.84% so far in fiscal year 2014. This shows that ESG recipients are hearing HUD's policy message on the greater emphasis for rapid rehousing. ESG recipients are evaluated by HUD on their financial performance using data within IDIS and specific IDIS reports. Both HUD headquarters and the local HUD field office have access to IDIS and monitor ESG recipients using the data and reports available in IDIS. ESG recipients should perform regular self-monitoring of the data and reports available in IDIS to remain compliant with the ESG requirements. ESG recipients should review the different data analysis opportunities detailed in this webinar and implement those that enhance program performance. These analyses can be used to evaluate grant and performance and program level performance and should be shared with ESG subrecipients to enhance program performance at the program level. The ESG interim rule requires that ESG recipients coordinate strategically with all the continuum of care that operate within their jurisdiction. ESG recipients should utilize the IDIS data reports and analysis outlined in this webinar to collaborate with the local continuum of care. Many of the analysis opportunities contained in this webinar can strengthen the collective knowledge of how ESG funds fit into the local continuum of care strategic plan to end homelessness. It is likely that the continuum of care and the ESG recipient will find the use of this data and reports valuable in forging a productive collaboration that assures ESG funds are strategically applied within the continuum of care. While the ESG interim rule requires ESG recipients to coordinate with all continuum of care in their jurisdiction, the COC application requires the reciprocal coordination of the continuum of care. There is an equal responsibility for coordination upon ESG recipients and the continuum of care. All continuum of care are evaluated and held to the same standard of coordination with ESG recipients in the COC application, also known as the NOFA. Many of the analysis opportunities contained within this webinar can strengthen the collective knowledge of how the local strategic plan to end homelessness fits with the ESG funds. These expenditure requirements constitute the foundation for ESG financial compliance that HUD, the ESG recipient, and the COC should monitor regularly. These requirements differ for state recipients and metropolitan city, urban county, and territory recipients. Here, you see the requirements for states. The obligation of funds, selection of subrecipient organizations, reimbursement of subrecipient organizations, and the complete expenditure of all funds are not recognized by HUD until they are reflected in IDIS. ESG recipients that collect and track this data outside of IDIS and do not enter directly into IDIS are non-compliant with the ESG interim rule and risk HUD monitoring. Shown here are the specific expenditure requirements for the ESG program and potential data analysis opportunities within IDIS. The expenditure requirement data can be found in part in various IDIS reports designed for the ESG program. The reports that we'll focus on in this section are the PR91 ESG Financial Summary and the PR93 ESG Risk Status Recipient Report. The dates for obligation, selection of subrecipient organizations, reimbursement, and full expenditure of funds are all based on the date the ESG grant agreement is signed by HUD. If the date that the ESG grant is signed by HUD is incorrect in IDIS, please contact your local HUD field office or submit and ask a question. Detailed here are the expenditure requirements for metropolitan city, urban county, and territory ESG recipients. As you can see, there are slight differences in the obligation requirements. However, the expenditure requirements and draw frequency is exactly the same as it is for states. It bears repeating that the obligation of funds, selection of subrecipient organizations, reimbursement of subrecipient organizations, and the complete expenditure of all funds are not recognized by HUD until they are reflected in IDIS. ESG recipients that collect and track this data outside of IDIS and do not enter directly into IDIS are not compliant with the ESG interim rule and do risk HUD monitoring. The administrative costs are 7.5% of the total fiscal year grant. In IDIS, the system does not allow you to go over the administrative cap and is managed by a sub-fund control. Please refer to the document Using IDIS for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program posted on the HUD Exchange and IDIS for more information. Street outreach and emergency shelter cap is the greater of 60% of the recipient's fiscal year grant or the amount of fiscal year 2010 grant funds that were committed for homeless assistance activities. This cap is not governed by a subfund and can be accidentally exceeded in IDIS. If you do exceed this cap, you may be forced to repay funds. Take great caution around committing and drawing funds beyond the street outreach and emergency shelter cap. Please note that the information on the street outreach and emergency shelter caps can be found on the PR91. Although not statutory or regulatory requirements, these factors are important to consider because they may indicate potential issues that could affect data quality and the financial management of your program in IDIS. Obviously, you can use IDIS to track rates of drawing down funds. Note that this is different from expenditures, which is how HUD measures compliance with the expenditure requirement. We recommend that you try to have IDIS reflect your internal financial records, especially in terms of the activities you are spending funds on and the subrecipient organizations. This is important because activities that are not properly set up in IDIS may not accurately reflect how you are spending your funds. It also helps you track subrecipient activity. We require the admin subfund because the 7.5% cap is statutory, and this assures that you do not go over it. Next, we're going to talk in more detail about the analysis opportunities contained within the ESG financial management reports. Before we proceed to the next section, let's answer poll question number 3. The primary reports for the financial management of the ESG program are A, the PR01, B, the PR02, C, the PR05, D, the PR07, E, the PR91. The answer is E, the PR91. With that, I'll be turning it over to Heidi.
Good afternoon. The reports listed on this slide were specifically designed for the Emergency Shelters Grant Path in IDIS and not for the Emergency Solutions Grants Path in IDIS. You can technically run the PR02 for HESG, but the information shown in the report is the same as that is captured in the PR91. The PR01, however, does not list HESG in the selection criteria in MicroStrategy. Therefore, you cannot run a PR01 for for HESG. The PR05 and PR07 reports may be useful for voucher reconciliations, but please keep in mind that for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, you are not only drawing by activity, but by subrecipient. Neither the PR05 nor the PR07 report include the subrecipient names. However, this information is included on the PR91 subrecipient voucher report. In addition, the PR12, PR19, and PR81 reports were specifically designed for the Emergency Shelters Grant Path and will not contain any information on the HESG grant path. In the past, your local field office may have asked you to include the PR81 report for the Emergency Shelter Grants Program as part of your keeper submission. However, the report will be blank for any program years after 2010. This is because the PR81 measures Emergency Shelters Grant Program beneficiary information, and HESG recipients enter this information in HMIS, not IDIS. Now we are going to discuss 3 specific reports that were created solely for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program in IDIS. Again, this is the HESG program path in IDIS. we'll go through each of these reports and identify key pieces of information and analysis points that can be broken down with each report. The first report is the PR91 ESG Financial Summary Report. This report is broken into 8 different sections and is run for a specific program year. We'll go through each of the sections of this report individually. The first page of the PR91 report includes these first few sections: ESG Program Level Summary and ESG Program Components. Again, these are for the HESG grant path. This is a great management tool and provides a quick one-page snapshot of your ESG program for a specific program year. Again, we'll go through each of these sections in depth in the coming slides. Here is a list of the last 3 remaining sections of this report. On the next slides, you'll see an actual copy of the report so you can familiarize yourself with each of the sections of this report. Our recommendation is to export this report as a PDF rather than an Excel document for formatting purposes. Many of the visual graphics on the report will be lost if you export them into Excel. Now we're going to show the first page of the PR91 report and start to dive deeper into the data elements and analysis possibilities. Again, this first page of the report provides a great snapshot or one-pager for your ESG program for a specific program year. This example report is illustrating 2013 data for this particular recipient. The 2 pie charts offer a visual opportunity to compare the same data contained within the chart above. This visual data can offer the same analysis opportunities, but often the impact is greater. Next, we'll discuss analysis areas for the PR91 report, and I will turn the presentation back over to Marlisa Grogan.
Let's take a look at the first section at the top of the PR91 report, the ESG Program Level Summary. You'll see that the grant number, total grant amount, total funds committed, total funds available to commit, and the percentage of grant funds not committed are listed in this screenshot. As seen on the full report that you just saw on the last slide, this section of the report also includes corresponding information on draws. So take a closer look at the graphic. The total funds committed column that you see on your screen are the funds that are associated with particular activities, the dollars that you, the recipient, have used to fund activities in IDIS. The grant funds drawn column are the funds that have actually been drawn down in IDIS. It's important to note the difference here between draws and expenditures. A recipient may have expended funds using their own local funding to pay for ESG activities before drawing down ESG funds in IDIS for reimbursement. It's helpful to consider the following questions as you analyze this section of the report. Do the total funds committed and the grant funds drawn match your internal records? Remember the distinction between expenditures and draws in answering this question. For example, if the recipient hasn't reimbursed itself for all funds expended on ESG activities, the local records showing expenditure amounts won't match up with the draw amounts reflected in this report. Along that line, do the draws to date reflect all of the recipient's expenditures? Are funds still available to commit? Think about why funds haven't been associated with specific activities if that's the case. What are the obstacles and the immediate action steps to get these funds committed? Checking the PR91 against internal financial records will help you determine whether draws are being properly and timely processed in IDIS and assigned to correct activity category based on your plan for spending and what you know has already been spent based on your internal records. The goal is for IDIS to match reality. If the committed and drawn amounts are incorrect, ask yourself, were the activities set up correctly so that the activity name and activity category match? As seen in this example, The rapid rehousing activity appears to be lagging in terms of expenditures behind the other activities. We do not mean to imply here that we want recipients to draw at a certain pace. We understand that there may be valid reasons. For example, rapid rehousing may take more time to be expended because it might be that you're serving fewer households with more resources. That's okay. Our point is that it's important to be aware of the lag compared to other activities and compared to the time left to expend, and be aware of the reasons for that lag. You should use this as a tool to make sure that this spending pattern seems appropriate based on what's going on with your subrecipients. A special consideration for this section of the report is whether the obligation and expenditure deadline dates on the PR91 are consistent with your grant agreement. Ensure that the obligation date you see on the PR91 matches the date of HUD's signature on your grant agreement. And check to see that the expenditure deadline is 24 months from the obligation date, the date of HUD signature. If there is an error, and we are aware that there are and have been errors, notify your field office so that we can make a correction. In any case, the date of HUD signature on the grant agreement trumps whatever date you see on the PR91 report, so don't totally rely on the PR91. Analyze the visual data presented in the line graph in front of you to understand monthly draw rate patterns. A steady monthly increase of cumulative funds is ideal, and any sharp lines, upward or downward, could indicate issues with processing draws or financial performance issues. The visual goal of 2 years grant expiration, seen on your screen as the blue diamond, is useful to assure that drawdown rates can meet the expenditure deadline. Don't forget, you're not done until you draw down the funds from IDIS. We've noticed that draws are not always completed promptly, and that's how funds do get left in IDIS for months and years. HUD does not want those funds sitting around, and we know that you don't either. Just bad fiscal management. Ideally, the solid line or the dash projected line will cross the grant amount line well before the 2 years grant expiration, which again is depicted by the blue diamond that you see there. If it appears that the solid line or the dash projection line will not cross the blue diamond, think about what can be done to quicken expenditures and draws. Consider whether you have particular subrecipients who are slow spenders that are slowing down the average and whether they need help. Maybe you aren't sure, so you could try to monitor or even just talk with some of them to figure out what's going on. In your experience, think about some other reasons for slow spending. What do other states do to manage this issue? The dashed projection line can be used to anticipate if the draw rate needs to be sped up or slowed down. When looking at this next section of the PR91 report, which is draws by quarter, consider whether the data indicate that there are consistent draws for each quarter. HUD understands that there are occasionally zeros in the first quarter as ESG recipients finalize HUD and subrecipient grant agreements. The third column shows the percentage of the entire grant amount that was drawn during the quarter, and the fourth column shows the percentage of the entire grant amount that has been drawn in total for all quarters to date. This analysis can indicate whether recipients need to increase or decrease quarterly draw rates. Are your subrecipients' expenditure rates affecting your draw rates, or could slower draw rates be affecting timely payments to subrecipients? The total drawdown for each quarter can be compared to your internal financial management records to assure that draws are being properly and timely processed in IDIS. If these amounts do not match internal financial records, what can be done to reconcile the differences? It's also worth noting that HUD recommends ESG recipients to complete all final drawdowns in IDIS within 30 days following the last reimbursement request from a subrecipient organization. This relates back to the requirement that recipients pay each subrecipient for costs within 30 days after receiving the subrecipient's complete payment request. Additionally, as ESG recipients begin to process the final drawdowns, Confirm that the funded amounts are correct for each subrecipient organization. If they are incorrect, reconcile these differences prior to the final drawdown. Failure to do so will cause lengthy data cleanup efforts and HUD involvement. This section of the report focuses on the Emergency Shelter and Street Outreach Expenditure Cap, which is explained in the fine print as the total amount of the recipient's fiscal year grant allowed for emergency shelter and street outreach activities. As Chris pointed out earlier, the total amount committed for both of these activities cannot exceed the greater of 60% of the overall grant for the year, or the amount of fiscal year 2010 ESG funds committed for homeless assistance activities. So whichever number is greater, that is your emergency shelter and street outreach cap. The report shows the amount committed to emergency shelter and street outreach activities, the total of those two amounts in the next column, the percentage of the total grant amount committed to emergency shelter and street outreach, the amount of 2010 funds committed to homeless assistance activities, and the total amount drawn for shelter and street outreach, followed lastly by the percentage drawn for shelter and street outreach. Here you can see that this recipient has committed and drawn all 100% of its grant funds on emergency shelter activities. This recipient exceeded both the 60% of the overall grant amount and the total amount expended in 2010 on homeless assistance activities. So yes, this recipient can clearly see that they've exceeded the emergency shelter street outreach expenditure cap and will have to repay those funds unless the situation can be resolved another way with the field office and/or SNAP's assistance. Use this report as a tool to track how close you are to hitting that cap before going over the limit. The data contained in this section of the PR91 details the different ESG components that each subrecipient is funded to carry out. This data is a good check to make sure that the ESG component and funding amount for each component is correct. If errors are found, users may need to correct the activity funding or revise a voucher. The PR91 subrecipient voucher report will be critical for this type of reconciliation. If funding is already drawn completely for a grant year, then you will need to submit and ask a question to the IDIS help desk for help with revising a voucher. The screenshot on this slide is from the PR91 Subrecipient Voucher Report, which is the other available PR91 report that you can access in IDIS. It provides greater detail that can be used to track subrecipient funding and help provide consistency between IDIS and your internal financial records. What we're trying to emphasize here is improving the accuracy of the reports, which can lead to increased effectiveness and improved oversight of your subrecipients and your program in general. Reports can be great tools, but if the data isn't right, then they're not useful. Check to see if each subrecipient has the correct activity type or types for which they were funded. Also verify if the activity types match the activity names, as this will also affect the accuracy and effectiveness of the IDIS reports. For instance, do you have an activity named shelter, but the activity type shows up as street outreach? If so, or if you're running against a similar discrepancy, this data will not pull correctly in the different ESG reports within IDIS. Ask yourself, does the total drawn for the subrecipient in the last column match the total expended in your internal financial management system? Compare the paid dates to the dates that subrecipients are paid by the recipient in the recipient's records. Is there a gap of over 30 days? If so, why? Are there any inconsistencies in financial transactions in IDIS versus that in your local financial management system? If so, which system needs to be modified to complete the reconciliation? I will now hand it back to Chris.
Thanks, Marlisa. IDIS affords us the opportunity to complete some comparative analysis by using the PR92 ESG Financial Summary National and Field Office Report. This report has two sections that we will detail. The first section, ESG state recipients and subrecipients, contains similar data points to the PR91. Here you can compare the total and percentage committed of each program component to other communities nationally or within a given field office. This comparison can help ESG recipients and COC leadership decide if their strategy to end homelessness is similar nationally or to contemporaries within a given field office or to communities of a similar population and geography. You can also compare the total amount and percentage committed to specific components to determine if their local strategy to end homelessness is typical or atypical. Specifically, given HUD's emphasis on rapid rehousing, this type of comparative analysis may be fairly valuable. Finally, you can compare total and percentage drawn of each component to other communities nationally or within a given field office. This may indicate if a community is particularly fast or slow in expending funds in different component types. The PR93 is a very handy report that demonstrates potential risk for the regulatory and statutory requirements of the ESG program. As you can see here, we measure as many domains for compliance as are present in IDIS. We're going to go into these in a little bit more detail now. Here is an example of a PR93 report, and you can see here if indicator A, which is no draws in the last 90 days, has an X, that could indicate that subrecipient organizations are not being reimbursed within 30 days, or that the grant is already 100% expended. If indicator B, which is more than 120 days between obligation and activity setup and funding, has an X, that indicates the process for obligating and funding projects with IDIS does not meet regulatory requirements. Communities can use this information to expedite the process. If indicator F, which is 100% drawn at 2 years from obligation date, has an X, this indicates that the program is not fully expended as required. Communities can use this to determine why that is not the case, why they did not meet the 2-year expenditure requirement, and what can be done to assure that they will be compliant in the future. If indicator G, which is more than 2 years from obligation date and not all activities are complete, has an X, that indicates the program has not been completed. Communities can use this to identify why the activities are not marked as complete, indicating the end of a particular grant year. Has this occurred because the grant was not fully expended within 2 years, or is it simply a data entry issue? These are just a few examples of the risk analysis opportunities that the PR93 can provide to ESG recipients. In the next section, we're going to provide you with further guidance and materials that you can use to gain further clarification on IDIS and the ESG program. Before we get there, let's complete our last poll question. In IDIS, can activities be funded from multiple fiscal years for the ESG program? True or false? The answer is false. You cannot fund an activity from multiple fiscal years under the grant-based accounting principles in IDIS. This is the basis for the ESG program's financial management construct and must be adhered to annually. Now I'm going to hand it off to Heidi.
Thanks, Chris. We hope that the information presented today has been helpful. HUD is currently working on 2 additional webinars that will drill down even deeper into ESG financial management and IDIS topics. These webinars will be posted on the HUD Exchange. In addition, you can review the financial management training curriculum that is available on the HUD Exchange. There are currently 3 modules available. Although this information is not specific to the ESG program, the information is very helpful for developing sound financial management practices. Remember that you can also request technical assistance or find additional resources on the HUD Exchange. If you need technical assistance that is more in-depth in nature, then make a TA request. If you have a specific question, you can then utilize the Ask a Question feature. For those individuals who asked questions during today's webinar and did not receive a response, please submit those questions through the Ask a Question. HUD has published ESG FAQs on the HUD Exchange, which cover a variety of topics such as program, policy, and IDIS questions. Additional ESG and IDIS resources are being added. The IDIS FAQs are currently being updated to ensure compatibility with the latest IDIS release and should be available soon on the HUD Exchange. Please make sure you're signed up for the listserv. That way you'll receive an automatic email when new resources are posted, and you don't have to check the HUD Exchange on a daily basis. Again, questions that were submitted during today's webinar will be added to these FAQs if applicable. HUD recently released a new page on the HUD Exchange exclusively for grants-based accounting resources. A specific ESG fact sheet will be added to this page very soon. Thank you for attending today's webinar on ESG Financial Performance Management. We received quite a few questions during the webinar, and now we have a few minutes. We're going to go over 3 questions that came up more often and that we see very, very, very frequently on the IDIS Ask a Question. The first question, why does the PR91 report not include information on the HESG grant path?
This is Marlisa. The HESG grant path information was removed from the PR91 report in the IDIS release 11.8 back in May 2014. You can use the PR91 ESG Financial Summary Report for specific information related to the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. This report will not include information regarding the Emergency Shelter Grants Program.
Thanks, Marlisa. Another question that came up more than once is, can I set up an activity for each subrecipient I have funded in IDIS?
This is Chris. I'll take this one. The answer is no. ESG recipients can only set up one activity per activity category per grant year in IDIS beginning in fiscal year 2011. The activity categories are street outreach, shelter, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, HMIS, and administration. For each activity, a recipient must identify the funding amount allocated to each subrecipient organization.
Thanks, Chris. And finally, a question that came up very, very, very often, and the activity category can change, is I will have leftover 2013 shelter funds. How do I carry those funds over to my 2014 shelter activity?
This is Marlisa again. Each year of grant funds must remain tied to a program year activity with the same year as the grant funds. Therefore, you would reprogram the leftover 2013 shelter funds to another 2013 program year activity, or make revisions to the individual subrecipient funding amounts for your 2013 shelter activity. You can't carry funds over from one grant year to another in IDIS for ESG.
Thank you, Marlisa. And again, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Again, we tried to answer as many questions as possible, but we know there are some that are still outstanding. Please submit those through the Ask a Question feature on the HUD Exchange. For program and policy assistance, please select ESG from the program area on the My Question is Related To drop-down menu. If you have an IDIS question, then please select IDIS from the Reporting Systems area. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the HUD Exchange within a week. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar.